Hi, my name is Denny O'Garindi, and I am at the Canadian Science Policy Conference, and I'm here with Milton Friesen. Thank you for joining me for a little chat.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm wondering if, for starters, you could give me a little bit of a run-through of your background, and more specifically your work with Carta's Social Cities.
Right. Well, one of the things that the program that I've helped develop at Carta's on Social Cities is looking at the social infrastructure of our communities. So we're commonly, we know there's roads and pipes and wires that keep cities running, but it's the people side of cities that I'm focused on in my work. And in that regard, always researching how we interact with each other, the organizations and groups we're part of, how those things sometimes work together and sometimes don't, and then looking at the innovative ways we could better connect with each other in our cities to solve common problems.
That's great. So kind of on the topic of common problems, what would you say are some of the largest science and or policy problems that you see in your space?
Sure. One of the big challenges we have right now is there's lots of new data, new tools, new technologies that are developing in our urban settings. But we have to put those tools to work trying to answer some basic questions, like one of our current problems is increasing social isolation. So there's more of us in cities, but we're not necessarily more well connected with each other. So we are digitally, but in other ways we aren't as connected. So you see social isolation increasing, even though we have the tools to communicate better with each other. So that's an interesting problem, and we're trying to understand why is that. And if that's the case, then how do we change it? And can we improve it?
That makes sense. What would you say it is about Carta's Social Cities that makes it kind of unique?
One of the pieces is that we look for problems. We're not a large organization, and my program's not that large. So we look for problems that are under-researched or under-attended, but that we think that by investing in those questions or challenges, we could make a difference in either their understanding or from a policy side, changing how the government responds to the needs and challenges. So social isolation is a big issue, and we think we have some ways of coming at that question that will be helpful for people. And we're going to need science to answer some of the questions, and we're going to need cultural engagement to change some other parts of it, because they're not all just science or technical questions. Some of them have to do with our cultural and social patterns, and so we're very interested in how those two things interact.
Right, that makes sense. So you're either kind of looking at gaps that you find other organizations aren't perhaps spending as much time looking at, or you're taking new approaches to try to address some kind of longer standing issues.
That's right, yeah, because sometimes you'll see tools used in one line and it occurs to you, well, what if we applied that set of tools to a different kind of problem? Could we answer the question in a unique way? And in some cases, yes, we have found some interesting answers. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Kind of switching gears a little bit,
Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about what it is you'll be talking about in your short talk at the Canadian Science Policy Conference?
Yeah, well, it's a privilege to be part of the conference, not only to attend, but to have a chance to address quite an interesting range of people. I think one of the things that is unique is the chance to have both the science practitioners, university leadership here, but also the political policy level people as well. They don't always mix in the same room. So the talk that I presented or pitched as an idea was to say, science, publicly funded science, has a common good obligation. So why do we take tax money and put it into science? Well, we think it'll make life better for us somehow. Solve problems, help us move around, communicate better, get rid of disease, that sort of thing. So we publicly fund it. There's another institution in our cities that's not usually sort of in the science mix, and that's religious institutions. Now, they also have a public good obligation because they can offer tax receipts to people because they're contributing to the public good. So I asked a simple question. If both of them have common good obligations, and they're both very important institutions in cities and in our community, does that common good overlap at all? Do they have anything in common with each other? Could they actually help solve each other's problems in some respects? And so I proposed that idea, carried that, filled in some of those gaps, suggested it, and happily was given a chance to talk about it. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So you mentioned kind of where there are overlaps between perhaps institutional science and religion, where they're looking to achieve common goods.
Right.
Why would you say that's important from kind of a policy perspective?
Sure. Well, imagine things like global warming. It's a fairly common topic these days. There's a lot of parts of global warming that are not science only. In other words, science can describe the problem, it can help us understand why it's happening, it might even know the mechanisms. But then as soon as we figure out what's going on, we're going to have to ask people to change what they do. So then it becomes a social, sort of cultural problem. In that regard, we're now stepping into a domain where religious communities, arts groups, these kinds of non-science groups are actually very influential in our lives. They're persistent parts of our communities. You and I will be long gone, and there will still be religious institutions, and there will still be science being practiced. So they're not going to go away, but they actually need each other. So we need science to help us answer certain sets of questions, and we may need religious communities to answer other sets of questions, or even to change human behavior, change what culture does. Those two are very closely related, and I think in Canada, there's that overlap. In my mind, is a very important innovation site, and it's not one that you see engaged in very much. So I think we're ready for that conversation.
That's awesome. So would you say then that there's room for kind of science and religion to work together to provide sort of an evidence basis, a new kind of innovative source of evidence to inform policy?
That's right. I think that one of the key pieces is that science has a certain set of capabilities to function in answering questions, pursuing understanding, but it's not complete. And religious communities have a different way of knowing and understanding. And what's interesting is that the same humans may occupy both spaces, so it's not uncommon to see the overlaps. I also think that they could help each other. For instance, science needs public support to get the funding required. We hear that at the conference. This is not an uncommon theme. Well, when they go and turn to the politicians and people making decisions about funding and priorities, who's the public that is supporting that? Well, lots of them are religious people that are part of religious communities. So if you want more public funding for science, you might need their support. Yeah. Now, if you make fun of those beliefs or somehow say that you're silly for holding such beliefs, and then you turn around and ask them for money, I think that's a problem. And most scientists don't do that, most policy people don't do that, but I think it suggests to us that when that does occur, that's not a great strategy. A much better one is to say, how could we be complementary with each other? How can we actually help solve these common problems together? I think there's lots of ground there that's still untraveled. So
yeah, it sounds like a very interesting space for problem solving, and I look forward to hearing a little bit more about it in your short talk.
Great.
So kind of as the final question to wrap up our discussion, what do you see as the greatest value of a conference like this where you're bringing science and policy together on kind of a national level?
Well, I think what's important is that this conference actually brings institutional leaders together to have these discussions. So I think these science and society issues are discussed in lots of ways in offices and labs and classrooms all over. But you don't often get a chance to have the institutional leaders to be present together. And I think this conference is very good at bringing that together. And I think there's room to continue to add some increasing diversity and an increasing range of institutions to participate in these kinds of debates and discussions. So they've made a great start. It's grown, significantly. I think that growth means there's new chances that are still ahead to extend that discussion.
That's great. That's awesome. I totally agree. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today, and I look forward to hearing more about your short talk later.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.